James, good to see you at this Cohesity event. You've got some research out which has come up with some, I suppose, revolutionary is a bit of a hard term, but I mean it's very insightful, isn't it? Literally, the top line from it seems to be that you've only got a certain amount of time after you've been attacked. How long have you got?
Well, it depends on the industry that you're in. I mean, most organizations find when they're actually under attack, they have no idea how damaging it is, and the loss of trust in networks and identities and applications, not just the data. So, each organization, each vertical market has a slightly different tolerance, impact tolerance, that they can sustain, but almost ubiquitously, no one is prepared for what happens. So the actual achievable recovery is nowhere near what it needs to be. They promise an RTO of 1 day, 2 days, and the reality of the incident knocks them into 2, 3, 5 weeks, months. That's just the reality of it. So it does differ, but
And this is also changing, isn't it? Because there is beginning to be the recognition on the board that actually their data is incredibly important to them, isn't there? This is a real change of focus.
yeah, and I think as we've gone into AI, if you think about that, organizations are seeing all sorts of new uses for their data that they haven't historically thought about. So they're talking about retaining more data than they ever have before because of the insights that they can draw for that. But I think the realization, just looking at all of the different logos that are hitting the headlines, organizations are seeing their peer organizations suffering huge elongated downtimes, which their business are promising them that they won't suffer. So boards are now leaning into the senior executives and making sure that they're governing the process as well and asking really awkward questions.
So how far up is that going? I mean, we've all seen these stats about the chief information officer, the chief security officer being under loads and loads of stress now, and that can actually affect their career longevity. So how far up does it go? Does it just stop there?
Well, I think the most interesting thing is organizations tend to take either a very security-centric view to cyber resiliency incidents like ransomware or wiper attacks, or they take a very business continuity and disaster recovery strategy. But the reality is you need both, right? So you tend to find that the CISOs or the CIO's feet are being held to the fire, but the reality is it needs both. It needs response and recovery. And in a lot of organizations, those two teams aren't joined at the hip. There's not a coherent closed loop process with handoffs between the two of them. So it's interesting, one or the other, feet will being held to the fire, but success needs both, right? To collaboratively work in the shared responsibility model. But then we've also got, in highly regulated industries like insurance and finance, we got the emergence of operational resiliency managers, because regulations like PRA and DORA are requiring organizations to not just have a recovery capability, but a response capability to recover trust. So I'm seeing other personas start to come into this mix, not just the CIO and the CISO as well.
Okay, but somebody was talking to me earlier. They were saying that as a result of the attack on Jaguar Land Rover, for example, that had a massive impact on the UK economy. Somebody was saying to me 1% of GDP. Surely the impact of things like that must mean that people, as you say, in certain industries, they will be sitting there and thinking, this is more than a business issue.
Yes, it definitely is. I mean, people still treat it like a technology issue. They haven't even expanded it to being a business operations issue. They still think, have backup, everything's fine, right? They don't think about the additional stages you need to do to recover in a secure state. And Jaguar Land Rover is a classic example because there is a very long tail of that attack. So if you look at the fact that Jaguar Land Rover has a number of suppliers where Jaguar Land Rover is their only customer. Jaguar Land Rover may have, as you say, being a large part of our GDP, the money to withstand an incident. But what about those suppliers? If those suppliers go to the wall, you can bring back your systems months later and still be solvent, but your suppliers that supply essential parts to your supply chain are no longer in business, and the government had to bail those supply chain partners out. So, this operational resiliency question extends beyond your organisation into other organisations that can be impacted as well, your contractual obligations. And that brings up this concept of a minimum viable company. This fact that you have to keep people safe, you have to meet regulatory requirements, your contractual requirements, and keep revenue flowing in. And a lot of organisations haven't modelled what that minimum viable company looks like.
I mean, it's interesting you say that about the supply chain. We interviewed one of the former MPs in that area, and he said there actually were companies that had gone to the wall that didn't get bailed out by the government. So as you say, that cyber attack has actually knocked out a section of your capability.
Yeah, and think of the long tail of that, much longer than the incident. And again, organisations need to think about these actions as operational issues, not as technical cyber events. Hence why you need the CIO, the CISO, but also the line of business to be integrated between all of them. And we speak to a number of customers in the operational technology space, in the manufacturing space, and those relationships and those supply chains are infinitely more complex than they are in traditional IT organizations. But that top-down approach is where you need to start with good governance of cyber resilience. It doesn't start at the bottom and go upwards. So we very much drive that view from the business downwards to the backup product, rather than just buying a backup product and everything's fine.
But that was one of the fascinating things that I found about your survey, was that the CEOs are now taking responsibility, or they say that they have to take responsibility. And that's really interesting, because in the US, for example, the regulatory authorities are insisting that you have somebody with technological competence on the board at a very high level, i.e. someone like the CEO. So what does that mean?
Well, I think that the shifting back of good governance is absolutely required, right? So for too many years, organizations have kind of got risk reports that say, risks are tolerant, we're managing our inherent risk to a way that's below tolerances. And then they're seeing their competitors getting hit and having these massive impacts. And I think they're now casting a tighter light on what the CIO and the CISO are actually doing. Like, are we just got the machine that goes ping, like in Monty Python, we keep buying technologies and magic bullets, or have we actually built an operational capability to withstand and sustain our essential business services during an incident? That is not a technology problem, that is a business problem, that's a revenue problem, that's a regulatory problem. And all these things sit with the CEO effectively. He has his guidance and his experts around him, but ultimately it sits with the CEO. And I think you're going to see more of this going forward.
I mean, that's fascinating, isn't it? Because I hear people say to me so often, oh yeah, we've got to understand our data, which I find quite amusing in and of itself, because you would have expected them to have done so. However, what you're now seeing too, and what you've been highlighting, is the CEO is going to have to understand his business in a really much larger way than they have before.
Yes, or lean on their heads of line of business to do it well. So the CEO can take the governance role, but ultimately he needs to enforce that at least these heads of those business units understand the relationships between their data, their services, their users, and also regulators and all those other requirements that sit there. We're very good at building these horizontal, compliance layers and things like that, but the responsibility ultimately sits with the lines of business, right? So depending on the size of the organization, obviously you're a very small organization, it's very easy to be a CEO and sit on top of everything. But in the kind of organizations I come from, one of the largest banks in the world, we got 4 completely separate lines of business with different regulatory regimes, different countries of operations and things like that. So it's very important that the line of business are empowered, but also they have the right governance structures for the area of the business that they are responsible for. So you need this tone from the top. You need the CEO to be governing the overall governance, but you need the lines of business to take responsibility for the risk in their area, understanding how their services deliver those safety, compliance, contractual obligations and revenue. And these are all business questions, not a lot of technology here.
And let's introduce the 2 dread letters of the 21st century. AI.
Yes.
That's a significant risk now, isn't it? I mean, people, they use the term attack vector, whereas what they just basically mean is this is something that attacks can come from.
Yes, I mean AI is a double-edged sword, right? And there's 2 aspects of threat from it. So we can use AI for good. So we use a lot of machine learning models, for instance, to detect anomalies and deletions and encryption to identify those attacks. So, and we're seeing a lot of security capabilities empowered by AI. But then there are 2 risks related to AI. The first one is everyone is throwing their data everywhere, right? Like inside the organization to pockets of models where it's not very well controlled and governed, or even up into cloud services and things like that. What kind of data are they putting there? So we spent years trying to go back to this good zero trust governance model of data, and now all of a sudden we're throwing it everywhere. So that's an inherent risk, but probably too long to go into in this conversation. But the one most relevant to destructive cyber attacks is the discovery of vulnerabilities. So frontier models like ChatGPT Cyber and Anthropic Mythos, they're very good at finding vulnerabilities. But I think there's a lot of people saying the sky is falling, new types of attacks. It's not new types of attacks. It's just more of the same. The way the adversaries are getting in, we see 1/3 of the attacks on our customers come in through vulnerabilities. So now they're just finding the vulnerabilities faster and easier, right? So we've lowered the skills threshold to discover vulnerabilities. We're going to discover more vulnerabilities. But the answer, building resilience, is the same. We haven't fundamentally changed what we need to do to rebuild the trust after these kinds of incidents. So organizations, the nature of ransomware and wiper attacks hasn't changed, but our response to it needs to be a little bit more prioritized. But it's the same as it was a year ago.
I mean, it's another fascinating thing, isn't it? Because as you say, it's sort of the same as, but this is augmentation, it's amplification. That's what AI does. I mean, it struck me in looking at a lot of these things that the old mantra that the security industry uses of CIA. I mean, you've mentioned needing to get data into the cloud, getting people to get these different uses from data. But at the same time, you have those 2 other factors, confidentiality and integrity. So, and that is the point, isn't it? Now, that goes to your resilience thing as well, doesn't it? Because if you're going to recover from an attack, you've got to make sure that that data is the data that you want, which, that seems to be the core of what Cohesity does.
Yes, and when you say data, and we already talked about the disconnect sometimes between a CIO and a CISO, data means different things to security people than IT people traditionally. So as a security person, to me, data is the documents, the tables, the SharePoint site, the website. It's not the infrastructure, it's not the application, it's not the network. But IT people, because they are backing that up, they typically call data the whole stack. So then we have this disconnect when we talk to each other. We're like, I'm going to recover my data. And security people, we're like, that's great. But then when you're starting to recover identities that have been compromised by the adversary, vulnerable systems, and all of these other kinds of things, then we have a challenge. right? Because we are recovering the things that permit the attack to resurface. So in a lot of organizations, there is this lack of process for restoring that trust. So our data has been lost. Is the integrity of that data good? Are we just focusing on getting it available quicker at the lack of trust in that data? We want to recover it quicker, and therefore we're not doing due diligence on making sure identities are clean, persistence mechanisms are removed, group policy objects that redistribute the encryptor have gone, and people skip that because they're not prepared. They think it's a BCDR incident, and they focus on availability rather than making systems re-available but with good trust. I'm bringing the system back harder, stronger. It's core resilience.
And that re-availability, that's availability, isn't it, really? If people are talking about making data available, they have to also think about having that incident and being able to get back up. Your research says that CEOs are thinking that they might have to resign if they can't do that, if they've got any downtime.
Exactly, and the challenge is if you bring the data back too quickly, or you take a business continuity and disaster recovery approach, so the CIO just takes his last snapshot and throws it back into production, which you can do after a flood and a fire, misconfiguration, power loss, equipment failure, very few variables, very easy to understand, compared with a cyber incident where you've got a human adversary, 15 stages of the attack, hundreds of different ways they can attack you, 0 days. If you take that snapshot and just put it back into production, you will get hit again and again and again. So that CEO who stands up and goes, it's all done, we're recovering now, all of a sudden they're down again, they're down again, they're down again, they're down again. Just look at these large logos that have been hit, and we're like, why does it take so long? It takes so long because they haven't prepared to recover that trust. And it's a term we use a lot in Cohesity, but it is, how do I know what I'm recovering is not going to go down again, right? And then how do I set that line in the sand and then make sure it hits all my requirements for that minimum viable company, regulatory, revenue, customer expectations, contractual obligations, and then drill it, and you can hit it. Most organizations aren't doing that. They're just putting a line in the sand based on business continuity and disaster recovery, and then they're expecting the business to be able to recover from a cyber incident in that timeline. And they're not even doing a drill to work out whether it's realistic or not. They do a tabletop theoretical exercise rather than actual drill of a real incident.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you about, and you've introduced it for me very well, so thank you. That tabletop exercise, I've been to the tabletop exercises that you do. Is that how you should do that sort of preparation? Is that one of the things that you need to do? And also, supplementary question on that too. Should you, in those tabletop exercises, also be mapping out your supply chain? Because it could be just one other thing that takes you out.
Yes, I think those tabletop exercises, they're designed to be the entry point into starting to understand your resilience, because it does talk about business issues, right? Technology is a very small part of it, because when you're in the middle of an incident, you have executive decision makers having to make risk decisions based on imperfect information with compromised communications channels. This is just the reality of dealing with an incident, where they don't know whether their identities, their data, their applications, their supply chain partners can be trusted. And so that's a very good first stage. But I think, if I go back to my military days, we had a military historian would come in and reenact the Battle of Balaclava and Salamanca and Waterloo with toy soldiers, right? But they didn't deploy us after only playing with toy soldiers. And that's the problem with if you only do tabletop exercises. You can make them more realistic, like we try to, by taking all the insights from the hundreds of incidents my team has dealt with. But, you really got to run a realistic drill. So, we recommend customers can use their Cohesity platforms, to clone a production environment, remove the production data, and then get your penetration testers to encrypt it. Like, get them to steal it. It's not live customer data, and you're then testing your people, your process, and your technology, your handoffs, your decision gates. Did you restore the systems with compromised artifacts still in them? Did you manage to realize how much data was stolen? These are all the questions that need to be answered and very rarely get answered by a desktop. So, we run full simulations as well, but that first step, that exercise that we do, the one-to-many workshop, is a good first step, starting to get buy-in for the more detailed ones.
I went to a cyber insurance incident or event where they asked me to talk. And oddly, ironically, I was with somebody from Defence Intelligence as well, who's an expert in backups. But the point that the people on the cyber insurance panel, they were being asked by the audience, shouldn't they provide a tick box to people in the industry? And they said, no, of course we shouldn't. Because if we did, they would just get the tick box done.
Yeah.
And they were saying what we want is we want to see cyber posture. We want to see people who are actively thinking about what the threat is and how they may answer it. Is that the right way to go about it?
I think that's a great answer, right? So, I've obviously worked in some fairly highly compliant industries over the years, and there is a lot of tick boxing, right? So we got this control, it's great, right? And it's usually the presence of control, not sufficiency and effectiveness that's being graded. And then the controls tend to get looked at in a very independent way, right? Not as a cohesive whole. So when you come, for instance, to deal with a ransomware incident, you suddenly find out that actually your access control policy is impeding you from being able to get break glass access to platforms. You tend to find out things like your endpoint detection and response solutions have been completely evaded. I think every single one of my customers who's had their data encrypted or wiped has an endpoint detection and response vendor, right? It's just they're not working in ransomware and wiper incidents. So I think it's really important that each organization has to look at what's important to them. They have to look at their threat profile, and then they have to look at how they have built and deliver their IT services. Right? You might go, that's a business impact analysis. It goes deeper than that, because there's a lot of resources that people don't think about, door access control systems. I rocked up in an incident, my first 6 hours were trying to get access to the building. I'm there with 6 incident responders. Before I was at Cohesity, we couldn't even get in to start incident response. That's a 6-hour delay. You've recovered your virtual images to a new hypervisor. All of a sudden, the software has realized it's on different hardware, and it asks for a license key that you didn't back up. It's these small things that add 15 minutes, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. The next thing you know, your 24-hour promised RTO has turned into a 1-week-long impact. This happens. Again, drills get that, right? The executive level desktop exercise does not uncover that. Getting the operational people that need to do it. And the most critical thing, organizations that haven't got processes, haven't predefined them, they have a hero. They have one person who knows how everything works, right? Knows how the systems fit together. They rage quit. Middle of an incident, this person, it's all on them, and they just like walk away. Over the years, I've dealt with so many things where that one pivot point leaves the organization, just quits in the middle of an incident, and everyone is lost. No one knows what to do.
Does that then argue for some degree of virtualization? I was talking to the vice president of NVIDIA a few years ago, who said that they were putting together systems for BMW, and that they were actually letting all of the workers practice in virtual reality, so that when they switched over a production line, they could just instantly know exactly what they were doing. Should there be that sort of digital twinning in resilience?
Yeah, I mean, it's a step process, right? You can't go from zero to hero. So my team spend a lot of time assessing where a customer is now. Like, what is their capability operationally, right? So that business governance layer, the people, the process, and the technology layer. And what we're interested in is where they need to be. So what is their target? What are the impact tolerances that they actually need to achieve? And then it's a question of how do you address those gaps? And depending on the maturity of the organization, it might just be simply as easy as getting handoffs between IT and security with what have we discovered about the attack and is it removed, right? You can't leap suddenly into doing drills if you're still at that stage. But ultimately, you need to go through those desktop exercises and then have this capability where you can continually drill. So if someone isn't dealing with a real incident, get them to deal with a fake one. Right? And then keep those fake incidents up to date with the latest tradecraft that adversaries are using, so you're constantly building that muscle memory. And then when an incident happens, immediately your people know what to do, who they need to work with, where to go for resources, what technology will support them. And so, I've always been a big fan of drills, but you can't always go zero to hero.
What you seem to be arguing for, or what you seem to be suggesting, in fact, is this whole new world. You're talking about a world that's evolved. IT was basically the stuff it was information systems. These were stuff that was in the offices. Now, because of this evolution into this AI world, it's, as you say, it's broken the boundaries and it's out there. And what you're really saying is, you have to have people who are aware of that.
Yes. And I think it's more fundamental than that. If I go back to my days at the bank, we didn't see ourselves as a bank. Our CIO, Dana Deasy, said, we're not a bank, we're an IT company that handles money. And I think all businesses have become IT businesses, all apart from the most smallest businesses, and even some of those are leveraging AI technology, web hosting, and everything else. So I think it's really critical that people understand that if they need to switch to manual processes, they don't scale. I got caught when that seat management software got attacked in Belgium, and they went to manual writing boarding cards out, and they had to cancel a third of the flights because manual processes don't scale to where IT has led us. And we've got to this situation now where the only way to really maintain our whole infrastructure and the way our life works at the moment is making sure we have resilience in our platforms. And there is a responsibility on business owners to do that. And there is a responsibility on government to do that. And regulators to make sure they are doing that. And they're starting to do it with things like DORA and PRA and NIS2.
Right, CEOs, suddenly they feel that they're a lot more responsible for all of this. Do you think that there should be a mandated responsibility? Do you think that there should be some liability in all of this?
Well, I think the liability is coming anyway, right, through litigation and regulatory fines, right? So I think organisations are starting to get used to that there is a real impact. And if you think about traditional cybersecurity incidents, fraud, data exfiltration, we only had reputational damage, which recovers after 6 months. That's the question. That's the statement that most security vendors don't want to take you. If you look at organizations that were hit with ransomware 5 or 6 years ago, they're all out of business, aren't they? No, they're not. Some are, some organizations are, but reputation recovers, right? I think one thing about regulations that people don't think about is it's not the regulatory fine, it's the continued oversight and lack of agility you have because you've got a regulator looking over your shoulder at everything you do. So you end up with a regulator giving you a matter that requires attention, and all of a sudden they're looking at every single thing you're doing with a magnifying glass. Your ability to respond to changes in the marketplace is slower, right? You're at a competitive disadvantage because you've drawn this attention on yourself. So I think that's one aspect that people don't think about. But being personally liable, we see CEOs resign. we see CISOs resign. We see CISOs say that hacks are unauthorized penetration tests and then pay the person as a consultant, and then it end up getting disclosed and they end up with criminal prosecutions. There's a lot of maneuvering and things like that, which is very common. I see this in my incidents. You're in the middle of an incident, but everyone's finger pointing. You're dealing with the incident and people are wasting cycles on blaming each other in the middle of an incident. Just get ahead of it. Good governance. Question what you're being told by the executives underneath you. Lean on expertise from organisations like ourselves. Do the right thing, and I think people don't have to worry about who's ultimately going to take the blame.
I mean, and this is really fascinating, isn't it? Because I've been maintaining for a long time that ownership is going to be one of the real contentious issues over the next 10 years. And again, during the course of this, all you've been showing is that everything is opening up. That term ownership opens up, because one of the things that people are going to come under pressure from is that people are increasingly going to start saying, I'm the owner of my data and I want to sue you because you haven't looked after my data properly. And then you've got, as you've just said, the CEO saying, no, actually, it looks as though I'm going to have to own the responsibility for this as well. So ownership is one of those terms that's going to spread in the 21st century.
Yeah, and I think it's spreading everywhere, right? So if you look at accountability, ownership, and responsibility, right? They're all concepts that are really, really important in data management. And then we look at the fact that we have very complicated supply chains now, right? So we're using models from a third party in someone else's infrastructure, right? With us handling, let's say, the access control systems for it. There's a lot of spaces that you can make mistakes, configuration mistakes that expose data in a way that was never expected. Now, who's responsible for that, right? Was it malicious? Was it just a lack of good oversight and good governance, or is it complete incompetence in which you can be sued? So I think as we got these organisations which are far more complicated in the way that we deliver IT services and the way that data is regulated, we're going to have a lot more of these issues, right? And it's not going to be a one size fits all. Every country has interpreted GDPR slightly differently, right? So it's very, very complicated for large companies managing these multi-territorial operations. And I remember, being part of the full service financial services organizations, like 59 countries of operations and 500 regulatory regimes, some of which conflicted with each other. You've got to get rid of the data, you've got to keep the data. So, very complicated situations from a compliance perspective.
And that is going to grow. I was at a off-the-record briefing with the EU a week and a half ago, and they were, unfortunately, the term sovereignty came up, and they were pointing that they were pointing out that they said that they were going to be working very, very hard in this area. I was a bit perhaps mean, because I said I thought that they probably needed 10 years to actually, but they were still saying that was something they were going to do a lot of work on. So that's another, because you're talking about regulatory compliance, unfortunately that's going to be in there.
Yeah, and it's a constantly changing world, right? So I've worked in the Middle East quite a lot for large companies over there, and it was all about data sovereignty in the Middle East. All of a sudden that changed a few months ago, right? And it suddenly said, how do we get our data out of the Middle East? After a missile dropped on a data center. I've seen the same thing. I'm working with a bank in a country, and that country, is a volcano, and it has 2 data centers either side of a volcano and data sovereignty in that country, and that's a risk, right? So, I used to run data centers in the Cayman Islands for an organisation I work for, right in the middle of a hurricane path. So, everything is a balance of risk. Right? And we've got to find everything we do in regulation has ultimately got to look at the risk of organisations and institutions that exist within the EU, right? So we shouldn't be legislating for legislation's purposes. It should be a balance of risk for that organisation. And I remember having conversations with workers' councils, in Germany, and they're like, you can't monitor this about an employee. And I'm like, well, if the business goes out of business because of a security incident where we can't monitor that happening, that employee's not going to have a job. So I'm like, what's more important for them, their workers' rights or having a job and being able to feed their family? And I remember having these quite serious conversations with workers' councils to find this medium. And I think hopefully common sense will prevail and regulators will find a way that allows us to balance risk and also deliver the protections of data we expect from individuals.
But yeah, I mean, it is inevitable though that there is going to be more regulation. That we can accept as a given. But if in this new world there will be regulation as people become aware of those risks.
Always.